Hey everyone, welcome back to Relish the Journey, hanging out with me, Miles Biggs, your host on this ongoing adventure. And my guest today is Lisa Tuccio. And I met Lisa on a networking app called Shaper. Really cool place to meet professionals. And we got to talking about business, and she opened up and shared some of her personal story with me. And after I picked my jaw up off the floor, the next words out of my mouth were, "You have to be on the podcast." So a little bit of teaser, right? Lisa, she was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS in the early 90s, and she is now blind from a genetic disorder. So talk about struggles on the journey, and we're going to hear about that story of hers, how all that came to be, and how she's bounced back since and found her way on this podcast. So buckle up, stay tuned, and get ready to learn something, everybody. Here is Lisa. Lisa, I appreciate your time here on the podcast. It's been a little bit since our first phone call, but I'm happy to have you back and now on record.
All right.
So we met on Shaper, which for anybody who might not know, it's a professional networking app, and sort of just hopped on a quick discovery call to see, learn about each other, see if we might be able to help each other in any way. And you started telling me your story, and I was like, holy crap, we got to do this again and hit record. Because your story was very interesting and powerful. So,
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about you, what you do for a living, and then we can just dive into what you started to tell me last time we spoke.
Yeah. Awesome. And I'm so glad to be with you tonight. I'm very excited to be a part of your podcast. My name is Lisa Tuccio, and my background really was in nursing. I spent the most of my career there and really, super loved that. It was like my identity of who I was. But, as life goes on, one door closes, another door opens up. I got into another industry, totally outside of the medical field. And then I started having some physical problems. That's when I really started having some visual problems. And it really made me look at myself. Reassess, where I was at. I was forced into another, career change, no longer able to work the same way I was because I was losing my vision. And it was like very jarring to go through that. And on top of that, there was a part of me that I hadn't talked about. And that was that I was infected with the AIDS virus back in 1993.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you were working as a nurse.
Mm-hmm.
That had to be a hard thing to juggle, being a nurse and also having HIV/AIDS, right? There's a lot of, opportunities for you to be exposed to other things, for you to expose others. I'm sure that was a juggling act for you.
Yeah, I mean, it was I worked in long-term care mostly, and so I was dealing with a lot of terminal patients. So it really was putting my own emotions and baggage aside. You really learn how to disconnect from the hard parts of yourself. And that was a big hurdle for me to overcome, that part of disconnecting that part of myself. Because one, I did think about the risk factors. I mean, that was one of the precursors to why I was leaving nursing, was that I was, worried more about the risk that I would occur than what I couldn't really infect somebody else that easily. There's been a lot of changes in the HIV/AIDS world. Somebody that's treated and undetectable really cannot transmit the virus, that's under undetectable levels. So that's a good thing. But back in my nursing career, it was something that I kind of separated. And that's kind of how I lived my life. When I first was infected, it was so painful and you can't really wrap your mind around it, but you just start believing your life is ending. I kind of started beginning living that way. Like, all right, I'm just going to plow through the next day. I'm not going to, I have to do all these things. I was having panic anxiety attacks and taking pills and, just learning myself about what this was going to mean to my life, and it was just like, I'm just going to put it on pause, and not tell anybody, because it really bleeds into your relationships. It bleeds into how are you going to talk to your friends?
Right.
How are you going to talk to your family? How are you going to exist at work? All of these things, which is quite overwhelming.
Yeah, and overwhelming now, I'm sure, but 27 years ago, I'm sure even more, because you said you're talking about advancements. We weren't quite as educated back then
Correct.
about everything, so I could definitely understand where that anxiety's coming from.
Yeah, you're kind of forced to live underground a little bit about it. It's kind of like a lot of things. There's a few things out there, and AIDS really is, one of those big ones that has a huge shame factor, because people can think, well, you got it from drugs, maybe you were a drug abuser, or you got it, just because you weren't a good person, or all these different things they can attach to you.
Sure.
And it's hard not to attach it to yourself, because it's how I viewed myself back then,
Yeah.
as unworthy, of love and support and community of people to help me through it. So it was very isolating.
I'm assuming that diagnosis came as a surprise to you, right? And no one's really expecting to contract that.
Yeah.
Was it
Yeah.
something where you knew how you got it at first, or is it still
Yeah.
unclear?
No, I knew how I got it. I was back in the early when I was in my 20s, I was partying quite a bit, and I was in a relationship with somebody that I was just starting to get my life together. I was like, you know what, I got to stop this partying stuff and kind of get my bearings right and think about career and all this type of stuff. And I was involved with a man that turned out he was a drug abuser in his past, and he was sleeping with women and passing the virus on to a lot of people.
Oh, that's terrible.
Um, and so I didn't find out right away. I found out a couple of years later, after he had passed away, and then I knew everything. Kind of was like, oh, that's what's wrong with me, because I had been sick and I'd had all the signs, and I would go to the doctors and they would look at me and say, you don't fit that demographic, of somebody we should test.
Hmm.
So I didn't know for a couple of years. And so when I found out, it was one of those things where I went down to Philadelphia. You had these anonymous testing centers, and, it was wait a week, get the test, wait a week. And then you went back, and it's just a long process of getting those results and what happens to you emotionally during that time. But I can tell you there was one saving grace that I hold on to today, is as bad as it was, like being on Broad Street, feeling like I didn't belong there, that there was a man there that just looked at me and he just said, girl, if you got this, you're going to be okay. And I don't know what it was. Was it something like a eye opener? I didn't know yet, but it just gave me that sense of hope. I just held on to that. And it kind of carried me through finding out that, yes, I did have it. And, that I'm going to live, I want to live. And so that's been was very powerful for me to
Yeah.
have the right person there at the right moment.
And was that just a complete stranger who just gave you some words of encouragement, or did you know who that was?
Yeah, I had no idea who it was. I was
Wow, that's
there
cool.
by myself, and I think he was homeless. I think he was like a homeless guy. I'm not really certain, but he sort of looked that way. But whatever it was that encouragement I needed at that time.
Sure.
So then that's when you get about the business of finding out what's next. What do I do next? And you get kind of get busy about how are you going to, educate myself about what AIDS is and what AIDS isn't. So I too had to go through this whole learning process.
Yeah. So
And
can we talk about that for a little bit, about what it is
yeah,
and what it isn't? Because I
yes,
haven't had many conversations around it, so I stand to learn something here.
yeah, yeah. So AIDS is an immune disease where it actually attacks a cell in your body that prevents you from building up your T cells. So like if you get an infection, your body knows how to respond to it and takes care of it. So the AIDS victim doesn't have that same response. So anything that's opportunistic, like a cancer, um, a cold, a flu, certain types of pneumonias that are what they consider opportunistic diseases, can flourish in the body. But what we know today is the less virus that's present in your body, the less likely you are to have those symptoms. And medication has come leap years during my time. I was lucky to get it when I did, because by 1996 and 97, they were coming out with the protease inhibitors. So what they do is these class of drugs, there's three different classes of drugs, and there's probably more, but the ones that I'm most familiar with that look at the cell and how it replicates and how the virus replicates and how do they stop it from replicating in the cells. And so that's kind of where they're at right now with it. And when somebody becomes treated, and they remain undetectable, they cannot spread the virus. So even if blood was to come from me to somebody else, they wouldn't get it. That's how far we've come. So the longevity of people are, that are hitting 28, 30, 40 years out is getting much greater.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm curious then, is you talked about going blind. Was that a symptom of AIDS, or is that completely unrelated?
It was completely unrelated. This was a genetic disease. So back in 2010, see, I knew I had it when I was in my 20s. My grandmother had it. It was a dominant gene in my family. So they kind of, you go to the doctor, you get your family history, and then they tell you about it. And so it's the same thing. I developed these coping skills of how to separate myself from knowing and the emotion of feeling until I am confronted with having to deal with something. So here comes this eye disease. All of a sudden, I'm having trouble with my retina. My visual field is getting smaller, and over a period of a couple of years, I was having cataract surgeries and all these different things. And so I no longer could do what I was doing. I was working in a plant doing mechanical work and stuff like that. And so I couldn't see well enough any longer. And I think that eye disease takes you out of society. AIDS was like, I could keep it private. No one maybe could know about it and I could move along my day. But with blindness, it became visual. Well, people could see me having a problem. People could see me running into things, not being able to see this or that. And so, you can't drive any longer. You have to ask for help more often. All these things around it begin to actually, people can know this. Now people can see me with a cane, and so that was just another level of, I'm trying to make my life work. I have AIDS, and here we go again. Just something else to make my life, in that depressive state, and to maintain that type of thinking that I had about myself, about life in general, and about what my opportunities could be. I viewed myself as disabled, and and when you view yourself in that way, you really lose planning. You don't think about your future. You just live kind of day to day. You don't allow yourself to get close, or, how are you going to navigate these friendships with your family? How are you going to tell your family about either the AIDS virus, or, how are things going to change to going to visit my family now? I have to ask them to come pick me up,
Right.
So it's just the whole dynamic shifts, and it takes work. It took a lot of work. It took some therapy. It took getting connected with other people with AIDS or with visual impairments. It really took me being responsible for my body to really start engaging people and taking a risk and saying, who's somebody I could tell? Because every time I had to tell somebody, an eye doctor, that I had AIDS, or a doctor about the virus, or the dentist about the virus, a neighbor, a friend, for some reason I had to tell them, or somebody, a coworker, or, it's a huge emotional strain on yourself. And so I had to get better at that. And so I began to, who's closest to me that's not going to judge me? So I started opening up to those people one at a time. Started telling my story one at a time, because it's hard living your life when you can't be fully authentic, when you can't feel fully present in a relationship, when you're hiding some of the most vulnerable parts of yourself.
Sure. Yeah, you stop living your life at that point. You're just sort of existing within your life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that vulnerability seems like it was a breakthrough for you, right? Being able to tell more people and just open up, and then I'm sure that helped you move through it and find power in it versus having it have power over you.
Yeah. So one of the biggest examples that I found that really shows me that by doing so, by risking it, that you'll have more benefit than you will people not liking you. I mean, I had people come over my house that knew that I had to tell, and they wouldn't eat with me or something like that, or
wow.
in the early days.
Yeah.
But I was after I decided, I'm going to go public with everything that goes on with my life and stuff like that. And I had a friend of mine that lived across the street from me. We were friends, and we had been close for a little while. And I was going public, and I hadn't even told him that about me. And I'm like, boy, he's going to see this on Facebook because we're Facebook friends. And here I am going to put this thing out there about me and HIV/AIDS and all this. And I hadn't had that conversation. And I thought I owed it to him to do a one-on-one versus the other way. And so one day I saw him outside, and he was sitting outside by himself. And I was like, okay, Lisa, I'm priming myself, and I'm jumping up and down. I got all this nervous energy. I'm just going to go over and tell him. So I run across the street, and I'm like, hey, I got to talk to you. And he's like, oh, what's up? And I told him, and he looked at me and kind of broke down, not in sadness for me, but he turned to me and said, I have something to tell you. And he told me about, his wife of 30 years, they're getting divorced, and what he was going through. And we both mutually related. We both risked vulnerability of sharing something deep and personal. And we both found a deeper friendship and connection because of it.
Right.
And I found out that he was familiar with AIDS. I found out that he had worked at the blood bank and that he knew all about it. I didn't have to educate him about it. And it was a wonderful thing that transpired and really has changed our relationship and our friendship going forward. And so that's what I love.
Yeah.
That's what I love.
Sort of a silver lining, right? Where the vulnerabilities can lead to that sort of a breakthrough.
Absolutely.
What would you say? It might be a weird thing to ask, and hopefully it doesn't come off disrespectful, because I know these are big things, right? Going blind, having HIV/AIDS could be broadly seen as negative things, not things one would look forward to. But how have they changed your life for the better now that you've sort of had time to move past the initial contemplation of them all?
Yeah, I mean, it really has. I'm not one of those people that's in the camp that says, I'm glad I have it, that kind of thing. I could probably have a good life without it all, right?
Sure, yeah.
But the thing that I see is that if you want to live a purpose, for me, it's a purpose-driven life. And I think in struggle, we can find purpose. And so my purpose has really been revealed to me to use these struggles and to use these experiences to go out there and share that and be open and be willing to connect and hear other people's struggles. I certainly still struggle today with these things, but it's led me to new business opportunities. It's led me to better friendships and closeness with other people that I traditionally may not have ever had. And it's really kind of just made me better because I had to do the work to be open to various opportunities to learn and grow that people take for granted. A lot of times we take for granted, our relationships, our love interests. We take people for granted for what they do and bring to us, and I think I find that I can really be present, be a little bit more vulnerable, be open, and just, it's just shaped me. It's hard. I'm trying to think of the right words to say, but it's really transformed me from my heart being heart centered and head centered.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, to be sort of corny, right? When you lost the external
Yeah.
vision, right? It's forced you to look inside and get moved from that head to the heart. It sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And it's active work. It's
sure,
active. It's not something that just happens. You really have to seek it.
right? And you rattled off a lot of words there, and you said you were trying to find the words. I'm curious if you had to pick 3 words, how'd you describe, the journey of your life? 27 years ago, you found out you had HIV/AIDS, going blind. How would you describe this whole, experience you've had with all of this in 3 words?
I'm worthy. Worthy. Well, I think about myself as learning that I'm worthy, I'm deserving, and I'm loving. So if love, empowering. I can rattle off a few words, but really, really core love centered, empowered, and worthiness, I think are what I think of to me today versus the broken person, 30 years ago.
Right.
That was lost, and
Yes.
didn't believe in herself.
So what advice would you give to people that might be listening to this that could be in that broken phase themselves with perhaps the exact same situation you're in or their own version of it? For those that are listening and feel broken or trying to figure out how to do that active work of, looking inside, what do you say to those people?
Well, seeking community of people that are familiar with what you're going through. And that's what I did initially, was just be around people that had the same struggles. And then I just educated myself about what was going on with me. I had to know about my disease process. I had to know that I could be an advocate for myself and not just be at the foot of the doctor's office. That I had to be strong in how I was going to advocate for myself in my own health journey. And finally, you learn how to share it with people. You really begin to look at your own story, that narrative that you tell yourself, and you pick, how are you going to be able to talk about it in a way that makes you feel good about you, and own your story. I made a little ebook about that, about the first couple steps of owning your story.
Yeah, what's the ebook called? Where can we find it?
So if you go to the livinghealthylist.com and look for me, Lisa Tuccio, you can find my ebook right up there on the Living Healthy list.
And what's the book called?
It's called Owning Your Story.
Yeah,
Hack Your Way Well.
We can link up to it when the episode goes out so that people can check you out.
Yep.
So people are listening to this and they've related to your vulnerability, sharing your story with us here on the podcast, and they would like to communicate with you further. Where could we direct them to find more about you besides that ebook?
Well, they can go to the livinghealthylist.com and look up Lisa Tuccio, and they can also go onto Facebook and just search Lisa Tuccio Hack Your Way Well. And that's where I put a lot of my content of how I really started to become empowered and really start owning my own story, my own health journey, and taking some amazing steps forward and feeling healthy, well, and happy. So, so that's the best spots.
Well, you will send people there. And I just want to say again, thank you. I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing everything you did share. I know I learned something, and I'm sure everyone that's listening right now did as well.
I really appreciate you, Miles, and really thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right. Powerful stuff. I appreciate Lisa sharing her story with us. And I appreciate you all so much for listening. Please, please, please share this podcast with somebody else, somebody that could take a lesson of vulnerability and open up about the struggles they're having in their life. If Lisa can do it, we certainly all can. So thank you again for listening. Appreciate you all so much. Until next time on Relish the Journey, cheers.